Hello, everyone. I am Valerie Paley, Chief Historian of the New York Historical Society and Director of its Center for Women's History, the first such center within the walls of a major museum in the United States. I'm pleased to welcome you to a virtual adaptation of the center's robust Salon series of public programs, which brings together leaders, thinkers, writers, and practitioners of women's history. These people embrace an understanding of history writ large, which heeds and celebrates women's critical contributions to the nation's past. Before we begin tonight's discussion, Native American women and suffrage, citizenship in the land that was once her own, I want to thank New York Historical's trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. I would also like to acknowledge Joyce B. Cowan, as well as Diane Max and her late husband, Adam E. Max, champions of women's history and of our center. Their support and yours allow New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. And now to our program. Our conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do be sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, our moderator will get to as many questions as time allows. We are thrilled to commemorate Native American Heritage Month with our expert panel of authors and historians organized by my colleague, Jean Gutierrez, curatorial scholar in women's history. Tonight, we remember the Native American women whose struggle for full citizenship and tribal sovereignty broadens our understanding of the suffrage movement beyond the ratification of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago. We will be joined by Cathleen Cahill, author of the new book, Recasting the Vote: How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. Professor Cahill taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years before moving to Penn State, where she is an associate professor of history. Her first book, Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, won the Labriola Center for American Indian National Book Award and was finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clements Book Prize. Joining Cathleen is Sally Roesch Wagner, who was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for work in women's studies from UC Santa Cruz. She is the founder of one of the first college-level women's studies programs in the United States and has taught women's studies courses for 50 years. She currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. And Dr. Wagner is the founder and executive director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation and Center for Social Justice Dialogue in Fayetteville, New York. Dr. Wagner's anthology, The Women's Suffrage Movement, with a foreword by Gloria Steinem, takes a new intersectional look at the 19th century women's rights movement. Among her other books, Sisters in Spirit, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Influence on Early American Feminists, documents the surprisingly unrecognized authority of Native women who inspired the suffrage movement. And our moderator tonight, Brenda J. is Northrop professor and former chair of the Departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is the author of several books in American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 and 1940, which won the North American Indian Prose Award. Her 2014 book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, won the American Indian Book Award and the Best Book in Midwestern History. She was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian and was past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Child was born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota, where she is part of a committee developing a new constitution for the 12,000 member nation. I now will turn the program over to our expert panel.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That was a very nice introduction. And I'm sure I speak for Kathleen and Sally when I say how grateful we are to the New York Historical Society for hosting this conversation. We're also very excited to have participants at this time of day when you could be, ending your week and doing other things. So we're very happy to have you taking part, and make sure as you're kind of listening to our panel that you're thinking of questions of your own, because we want you to be involved in this salon conversation as well. One of the things that the three of us on this panel have in common an interest in the era of the 19th Amendment. And to begin our conversation, we're going to show a short trailer of a recent documentary that I made with a colleague at the University of Minnesota with a lot of help. And I thought this would be good because it would sort of set the stage for the era that we're discussing. Not so much about the 19th Amendment or the suffrage issue, but just the general era that we're talking about. Because we also have to remember that in addition to the suffrage, issue a century ago, people were also experiencing a global pandemic, right? So we can maybe relate to that a little bit more than we would have, last year or at a different time. For American Indians, it was also a period of assimilation. And that was, most of us were not citizens of the United States. Citizenship was something we were supposed to still be working toward. And along with that came the suppression of various Native American traditions, including dance and even powwows. And that's sort of the subject that this film gets at. So you're going to watch a little short trailer of it, just 3 minutes. But I also want to let you know that it is available on YouTube. So you can just go in and look at it under the title. And the idea of this is that I wanted to make this accessible to colleagues, especially so many of us right now are involved in online teaching. And so if you're interested in getting a kind of historical perspective on American Indians and pandemics, this is kind of what we had in mind. So you can queue up and we'll watch together Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, American Indians and Pandemics.
Ojibwe people believe in the healing power of music and dance. I've discovered that the jingle dress dance and tradition first emerged during a global epidemic of influenza a century ago, one that was devastating to Ojibwe communities. This was also a time when the United States outlawed ritualistic dancing, making the jingle dress dance a radical tradition from its beginning. More recently, jingle dress dancers were at Standing Rock to protest a pipeline project that threatens our water. The tradition is very much alive today, invigorated by the passion and creativity of a new generation of women. Ojibwe people often tell a story about a little girl who was very near death, and her father and her family became, of course, very worried about her. Her father had a dream, a vision about a special dress and dance. He made the dress for his daughter and taught her the steps. The way folks at Mille Lacs tell the story is that there was a drum ceremony taking place that weekend, and the father brought his sick daughter to the drum ceremony. She was sort of lying on the side, taking it easy because she was so ill. Later on in the evening, they started playing these songs, and the little girl got up and began dancing. And by the end of the evening, she had recovered. I started putting together the story of the jingle dress with the flu epidemic because of that story. Ojibwe people believe that spiritual power moves through air. The sound of the tinkling of jingle dresses is part of healing. And so Ojibwe people still tell the story of the first jingle dress dancer, who was a little girl.
Okay, great. Let's dive right into our conversation because we have limited time. I want to begin by asking Cathleen about her new book and the research that she's been involved in the last few years. I think most of us realize that for most of US history, citizenship was connected to whiteness. And I think of, my own grandmother, who wasn't a citizen of the United States at the time of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So can you talk a bit, Cathleen, about why you decided to write this book, and especially the part of it about Native women and how, despite the many circumstances that they faced at the time, they were also part of the suffrage struggle as you see it?
Sure, thank you. And I'm really delighted to be here in conversation with you and Sally. I'm delighted, and to everyone who's joining us. And I also just want to put a plug in for the film. I've used it in class and my students really, really loved it. It was great. So I came to this topic actually through my first book, which was looking at the employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in that research, I came across a woman who's from Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation named Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But she had initially come to Washington, D.C. To fight for treaty rights. Her father had been hired as the attorney for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. She worked as his legal clerk. They were both tribal members. And while she's in Washington, she becomes very politically active within two groups, and one of which is the Society of American Indians, which was a group of Native intellectuals, very highly educated, many of whom were employed in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And as you point out, Brenda, this is a moment in federal Indian policy where the federal government has dismantled tribal governments, no longer recognizes them. Legally, Native people are wards, not citizens, legal wards, which puts them in a class of same level as children or mentally incapacitated people. And then the federal government is trying to assimilate them into the US citizenry. And one of the sort of measures of whether or not they kind of had reached that point was that they were given citizenship and expected to become voters. But most, as you say, most Native people were not yet citizens, but that was sort of the goal. So the vote in a lot of ways was meant to be a strategy to dismantle Native nations. So the Society of American Indians is quite critical of those federal policies, except to the extent that they see citizenship in the US and suffrage as a potential source of power that will help them address and reform federal Indian policy. And I'll come back to that in a second. So she's one of the founders and part of that organization, so involved in those conversations. She also ends up going to law school in Washington at the Washington College of Law, which is now American University's law school. And it's a school founded by feminists to train women. Women were not accepted into most other law schools. NYU is an exception. And so it, as you might imagine, is a hotbed of suffrage activism. And these two things kind of come together. So Marie Bottineau Baldwin marches in the 1913 Washington, D.C. suffrage parade. And when I learned that, I didn't know she was there. I didn't know any Native people were there. It's quite famous. This is the parade that announces, Alice Paul's announcing sort of a return to a constitutional amendment in the suffrage struggle, and kind of kicks it off from there on the weekend of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And so I wanted to know, why was Marie Baldwin there? And were there other Native women who were part of these conversations about women's suffrage? And the other thing I'll say about that story is that the parade organizers actually asked her to put together a float that will represent sort of traditional Native women's or traditional matriarchal positions. And she actually declines that. She chooses instead to march with her fellow law students, which I think was a deliberate choice, and emphasizing of her sort of future and her position as a lawyer. And when she graduated, she really emphasized that all women should be lawyers, but especially Native women, because she said they need to be able to protect their land rights. So she was both part of conversations calling for US citizenship and suffrage for Native people, but also really emphasizing that that didn't override the sovereignty and land rights that Native nations had, and the relationship that they had with the federal government. And she's a lot like the other Native women that I ended up looking at, Gertrude Bonin, who's Yankton Sioux, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's Wisconsin Oneida. And all three of them were theorizing what the relationship of Native people should be to US citizenship, but all three of them also emphasized that that citizenship shouldn't override treaty rights and Indigenous sovereignty.
Very good, thank you. I have so many questions about your comments, but I also want to maybe pivot a little bit to Sally to think about this in terms of, various locations throughout the country. I wonder, Sally, if you would talk a bit about Haudenosaunee women. How did suffragists learn about Haudenosaunee women and the fact that their political situation within their communities and nation might be very different than the legal position of women in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm in Syracuse, New York, which is in Onondaga territory. The center of the Confederacy, the firekeeper, at the Onondaga Nation, the 5-nation Confederacy. How did they know? Well, first of all, the women on this land where I am today have had political voice for 1,000 years, while we in the United States this year are celebrating 100 years of women having political voice. The Confederacy was founded on the shores of Onondaga Lake, 20 minutes away from where I am now, and the women have traditionally, from that time, been responsible for the position of leadership. The clan mother and the chief, the sachem, are in balance. But because the women are the ones who are raising the boys and watching them and seeing, they watch for the boy that sort of stands back and listens very carefully and sees what everyone needs. And that child then, if let's say that they notice that there's an elder that needs something and they provide them with it, the clan mother will look at that boy and think that would be a good leader, not the one who puts himself forward. And so she begins to train him up. When the old chief dies, the symbol of the authority of that position returns to her, because leadership is through the uterine line. And she then will ask all of the women, is there anybody that knows any reason why this young man should not become the sachem? And if anyone, a young child, says a reason not, then that man will not be considered. There are three absolute rules that I've learned from the clan mothers. One is that the man cannot have committed a murder. If he's a warrior, he needs to step down because it is a peace confederacy. Another one is that he cannot have ever stolen anything. He can't be a thief. And the third is that he cannot have abused a woman. Now, let's say she puts him in position. She is the ears and the eyes of the clan, of the people. He is the voice. So the voice, of course, has to listen to the eyes and ears to know what to say. And if the chief strays, let's say he gets off the path, he makes a decision that will not be a good one for the seventh generation, she brings him back. She brings him back to the path. If he strays a second time, she brings him back again. And if there's a third time that he does something that is not in the will of the people, she removes the horns of authority. In the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton at a speech to the National Council of Women in 1891, she cuts off his horns. And that's one of the ways that it's described. So here are women, if we just look at the issue of political voice alone, here are women who live in a world in which the common law is actually based on the idea that the Blackstone Code, that women, once they marry, become dead in the law. You just cease to exist legally. And so, of course, you have no political voice. You can't sue or be sued. You can't sit on a jury. You can't sign a contract. And of course, you can't vote because you don't exist legally. After the revolution, every state passed a law as they wrote their constitutions, making it illegal for women and African American men to vote. But what these women saw, and if we think about how did they know? Well, these are white settler colonial women moving into a well-established territory. And they're the immigrants coming in. And there are all these stories of survival is dependent on the Native people and their teachings and it's one Thanksgiving story after another as we travel across the now United States in the process of settlement. So these women, every one of them that I've looked at, the major leaders of the women's suffrage movement, and I'll just point out three. Lucretia Mott, she lives in Philadelphia, but before she comes to Seneca Falls, to Waterloo, and they plan that first 1848 Seneca Falls local convention, Lucretia Mott has spent a month at Cattaraugus, one of the Seneca communities. And she has watched these women with their political voice. She's watched them owning their own possessions, which white women didn't at the time once they married. Everything became their husbands, of course. And the children coming through the female line in her world, in the United States world, of course, the patrilineal line, but also she saw women who had authority and voice and personhood. She comes to Seneca Falls. When she describes her summer of 1848, and I have the letter she wrote to the Liberator, an anti-slavery paper, in my anthology, she devotes 3 paragraphs to her stay at Cattaraugus and 1 paragraph to the Seneca Falls Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her nearest neighbor, was a white man that had building a shop at the Onondaga Nation. He'd been given an honorary adoption. He spoke Onondaga fluently, and that was her nearest neighbor. She had a cousin that was named for an Oneida chief, Peter Skenendore. These connections are just throughout. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, she writes when the chiefs in 1878 decide that they will not accept citizenship in the United States. And they in council, she said, as they've been meeting since before Columbus, they make the decision that they will not accept citizenship in New York State. There's a law that is being considered in the New York legislature.
Yeah.
She writes an editorial in support of the chief's decision in her newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box, which is the official newspaper of the National Woman Suffrage Association. She writes the editorial in support and says, it's the greatest hypocrisy that the government is denying citizenship to its women who are demanding it, while it's trying to force citizenship on Indian men, the better to steal their lands. Justice to the Indians requires living up to the treaties that we have with them. And she says they're sovereign nations, every bit as sovereign as Mexico and Canada. And it would be like forcing citizenship on.
Yeah.
1893, she's given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation, and she is considered for a political voice in that adopted Native nation. So the connections were very strong. And I think seeing this is what our lives could be like was the impact, the influence.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. When I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think how great that idea is, that concept of women choosing the next political leadership for the nation, and the part about no lying, you're disqualified if you tell lies, has particular resonance for me right now. Cathleen, I wonder if you could kind of follow up a little bit and talk about what was going on in Indian country. You know, you wrote in your book about South Dakota, you were talking about some of the major figures, but you also had, you know, suffragists moving out into other regions of the country, interacting with Native women. What was going on there?
So I really sort of pick up the story kind of in the next generation after the women that Sally's talking about. And there's this continued interest in Indigenous traditions. But as you say, it sort of depends on where you are. So in 1890, Susan B. Anthony brings two young workers, Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, to their first state campaign in South Dakota. South Dakota has just become a state, and they had left the question of women's suffrage until to the first election as a state. And so there's a referendum about that, enfranchising women, doesn't mention race. And then there's also a referendum to enfranchise Native people, and also doesn't mention sex, but they become discussed as, obviously this is going to enfranchise white women, and the other is going to enfranchise Native men. And the white suffragists turn to rhetoric that very much draws a contrast between, well, we're white educated women, and they literally describe Native men as in blankets and feathers, being invited to the Republican convention in South Dakota, while Susan B. Anthony has to kind of stand on a chair in the back, right? So they're drawing this contrast between the men of South Dakota seem more welcoming of Native men than they do to white women. And in fact, both of these pieces of legislation fail, but more people seem to vote for enfranchising Native men than they do white women. Part of that's because of how it was written, but nonetheless, Anna Howard Shaw sort of uses this in a speech she gives a few months later. And again, it's part of white suffragists. One of their arguments, sometimes they were looking at Native people and talking about how wonderful their communities were and politics and how they offered an alternative gender roles. But sometimes they were using more racist arguments that white educated women should be enfranchised first. And she gives a speech that really says, you know, that we were treated horribly in South Dakota. Both Native men and immigrant men, non-English speaking immigrant men, were welcomed by political parties and not us. So it does depend where you are in the United States. but certainly Native women did sometimes use this sort of romantic and interest in Native traditions to get a platform and to get on stage and be invited to suffrage events. And then they would use it very strategically, right? They knew what white suffragists wanted to hear. They often would wear, Gertrude Bonnen calls it her costume, right? Buckskin dress, her hair in braids. But then she would flip it and she would say, I'm going to talk about the Indians of today, right? And very deliberately talk about the problems that Indigenous people were facing on reservations under federal guardianship. And she talks about, for example, the health problems that were so exacerbated by the influenza epidemic, or the removal of children to boarding schools, or the fact that Native people couldn't access their own bank accounts without permission of federal agents. So kind of using that interest in Native people to gain a platform to then educate them about what the issues of concern in their communities were.
We only have a few more minutes before we get everybody into the conversation, which we're very excited about. But I wonder, Cathleen, if I could just follow up and ask you why you think government boarding schools also became a site for conversations about, not just citizenship, but women in the vote. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly the question of women's suffrage is a national conversation, right? Everybody's talking about it and has an opinion on it. And the boarding schools are places where, the federal teachers are trying to educate Native children to be part of the political system. And so these questions come up. There's also, right, gender roles in the United States. There are very particular gender roles for women and men at the time. And the boarding schools are very much based on teaching Native girls to behave in certain ways and Native boys to behave in other ways. But the question of suffrage then is absolutely part of what they're talking about in those schools. So, I'm here in Pennsylvania, where the Carlisle Indian School, the first federal off-reservation boarding school, was built. And they were, for a couple years, they would have debates in the student clubs where the questions were about, should women who pay taxes vote? Or should women earn the same amount of money as men? And it was a way of preparing the students to, again, enter U.S. society and be politically engaged.
So we're about at the time now where we can take questions. So make sure that you're, if you have thoughts and you want to join in, you can just put those into the chat conversation and we will see those pretty soon, or at least I will see them and ask the questions. But actually the first question is sort of directed at Cathleen. And that is, could you speak a little bit more about the process of selecting the women profiled in your book? You already talked about Baldwin as being a very essential person, but what about Kellogg? Is there anything more you want to say about, or did these were people who just popped out in the narrative,
They in some ways popped out, but it's because all three of the women were very engaged in talking to white suffragists, and they all were publishing sort of political theory. So Laura Cornelius Kellogg publishes her book, Our Democracy and the American Indian, in 1920. Right, so exactly the same moment that the 19th Amendment is ratified. Gertrude Bonnen publishes her second book, American Indian Stories, in 1921. And the final essay in that collection is a rewriting of a speech that she gave to the National Women's Party. So all three of them were having this conversation with white suffragists. I think we've sort of alluded to it. Sally raises the point that not all Native people wanted US citizenship. And there were certainly Native women who, emphasized citizenship in their own nations and were working within those communities. But the reason that I picked the 3 women that I did is because they were really directly engaging in this national movement. And because I could use their political theories to think about why they wanted suffrage, right? And what they envisioned as this relationship between the US and Native nations and how suffrage fit into that.
Yeah.
And I will, let me add, sorry, right, that Native people as a whole are not, Congress doesn't give them US citizenship until 1924.
Right.
So the 19th Amendment doesn't apply, as you said, to your grandmother or to many other women.
Right.
And I might just add that the Confederacy does not recognize U.S. citizenship, that they continue to remain a sovereign, each of the nations, their sovereign nations, not dual citizenship with the U.S.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sally. And I would say, you know, even for communities like my own, which is Red Lake Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, we take our tribal citizenship very seriously, even though I'm always astonished at this, and I can't remember the exact number, but the voter turnout this week on the Red Lake Reservation was something around 92%. Isn't that an incredible story, you know? So I wonder too, we have just a quick question for Sally, and that is, when you wrote about the connection between suffragists and Haudenosaunee women, you wrote a book for younger readers.
Mm-hmm.
And what was your thinking there? I mean, I think I know, given the way you related, you know, your interest in this story, but why did you decide to go that route?
Yeah, it's this book, We Want Equal Rights. And the reason was because several. One was that my students would come into my classes and end up really angry. Why did I never know this? And realizing that there really weren't materials about the influence, the Native influence on the women's suffrage movement available for high school and a bit younger. Seemed something to do.
Right. Yeah. I think that's great. And I'm someone who, you know, has written a children's book for very young readers called Bow Wow Powwow. Someone told me that I may write other books, but I'll never have a better title than Bow Wow Powwow. And so I agree with you. I think that's a really, you know, an audience. We have to teach people, young people, about American Indian history and the real history of this country from the time they're very young, not just, you know, later in life. Okay, I think this is really a terrific question. I think maybe all of us might be wanting to address this in one way or another. But the question is, did the work and activism of Native women during this period inform or influence later political activity? So the events listed are Wounded Knee in the 1970s, or of course the more recent protests against the pipeline projects in the Midwest at Standing Rock. So you can think about that for a second if you want, or jump in, either of you, if you'd like to address it.
I mean, I'll say sort of a direct connection is Gertrude Bonen's work is sort of rediscovered and reprinted in the 1970s, sort of with the Red Power movement and the rise of ethnic studies. And so her work, particularly her as a literary figure and someone who was critical of assimilation policy, certainly has been read by kind of now probably 2 generations of people in Native studies and ethnic studies. And I do think her writing has influenced that. So I'll stop there and keep thinking.
Yeah, that's great. Sally, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, here's just a quick one. I was involved in the left in the 1960s and 70s, and Basic Call to Consciousness, that was written, I think, in 1970, around then, was absolutely influential in the I think the anti-war, the women's rights movement, all of the movements that we were all part of. And that book still today is absolutely critical, written by Haudenosaunee. And I'm thinking too about Tom Hayden, The Love of Possession is a Disease with Them. And that was another really important book at the time, and he was influenced by Native people, and the title reflects that.
Oh,
So I think that
no idea.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just said I had no idea. That's interesting.
Yeah, and also I think that the support, we supported Alcatraz, the takeover of Alcatraz, and we were reading, I was in California, we were reading Akwesasne notes that was coming from Mohawk country. So I think that is a history that really needs to be talked about and further developed.
Yeah.
And I think just generally, right, that what our histories are showing is that there's a really long tradition of Indigenous women's activism. And to me, thinking about Idle No More and Standing Rock, for example, those are movements that were really started by women.
Yes.
And so I think that even if there's not sort of 100% direct line, it really demonstrates the way Native women have been so engaged and often really connected to their communities. The women I write about lived in urban areas and were connected, but didn't live in their homelands most of the time. But so this political activism happens in lots of spaces, but there's a long tradition of it.
Yeah.
Can I call out? I'm sorry.
I guess I would. Go ahead, Sally.
Just to call out one quick thing, rematriation. It is online. It is done by Haudenosaunee women, and the idea is that we need not just to decolonize and re-indigenize. We need to rematriate. So it's a contemporary activist. Sorry.
I'll just say that before I forget this point, because I'm very forgetful these days. Because the question says work in activism, I will make a point about the Jingle Dress Dance that you could see, get into a little bit if you watch the longer documentary film. I also talk about this in my book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, in a chapter on healing. But I do see a direct link between the Jingle Dress Dance arising in the circa 1920 and later activism, a very direct link, because the time the Jingle Dress Dance arose, as we were mentioning a few minutes ago, it was a time when Native American culture and spiritual life and religious traditions and so forth were being directly suppressed in the history of the US. And that infamous dance order came from Washington in 1921, a circular that was sent out to all the Indian reservations. And I think how interesting that women created a whole new tradition of healing at the very moment the United States government is saying, you can't perform these dances. These are pagan. These are just a thing of the past. And so I really think it was that, that radical element, if you want to think of it that way, was part of the Jingle Dress Dance from day one. And so in recent years, there were Jingle Dress Dancers at Standing Rock here in Minneapolis, where I am. The Jingle Dress Dancers came out to perform a healing dance at the site of the George Floyd Memorial in collaboration with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I don't find these things like some whole new thing, because I think they were part of the Jingle Dress Dance from the very beginning. I think it was an anti-colonial movement. Okay, let me look over here at the questions. And no one has said you have to stop this minute. It's 5:15 and we're nearing the end, but I think we do have time for one more question. And this is, a very, very good question to ask. So what year were American Indian women finally allowed to vote? And how do you think Indigenous women felt about maybe suffragists at the time saying, you know, that they were, you know, well, what do you think their thoughts were at the time when votes finally came to women? Anybody can answer that. To Native women.
Well, I'll just say, so 1924, with the Citizenship Act, Gertrude Bonnen is really excited about this opportunity, and she, in 1926, forms a new organization, National Council of American Indians, and she starts traveling each summer around to Indian country, founding sort of local lodges, and that's what she calls them, lodges. And the plan is she's explaining the Citizenship Act, she's encouraging people to register to vote, she's trying to turn out the vote, and she's really got this vision of there can be, maybe not nationally, but in certain states that have large Native populations, there can be a Native bloc that's big enough to swing elections and to make people sit up and pay attention, right? New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, the Dakotas. And she's right. And she has these great pamphlets where she talks about how many people are in each state. And I think about the election that's just happened, and there's been a lot of news about Arizona and the Native vote in Arizona and how that mattered, or which counties in Montana and South Dakota, you know, map onto, right, some of the bluest counties in those states map onto reservations. And so I think we're seeing some of that come to fruition. But what happens in the 1920s is she's doing this, as are other Native people, and they're turning out to vote. And in fact, Charles Curtis is the nation's first vice president of color, right? Kamala Harris will be the second if that's finalized. But he's a Native man who's elected Herbert Hoover's vice president in 1928. So there's this real excitement about the Native vote in the 20s. But there's also a real fear by a lot of white politicians who are worried about upsetting this. And in the 20s, you begin to see laws and court cases that disenfranchise Native people just as they're gaining citizenship. And those laws are not overturned until after World War II. So New Mexico and Arizona in 1924 say that under the state constitution, Native people can't vote. Those aren't overturned until 1948. There's still a county in New Mexico that has laws disenfranchising Native people until 1962. So the Voting Rights Act was actually really important for Native people as well.
Right. That's a point I'd like to emphasize with my students. But Cathleen, I wonder, just because you mentioned that Kamala Harris is not the first vice president of the United States, or will not be, should she be elected, who is a person, you know, I don't use the term person of color too often, but you know what I mean. Do you think it's forgotten in the news media? Is that point, do you ever see her? Do you see her mentioned as this is landmark because she's the first ever? Do you think it's forgotten that he was American Indian?
I think Charles Curtis is usually forgotten. It's interesting. I had a conversation on Twitter this morning with someone, and we were both saying, is he going to come up if right, this election is finalized? I think it will be celebrated that she is the first woman of color, in particular, the first woman, right, vice president. And so that will be the focus, and the first African-American, and of course the first Asian. So she's a lot of firsts, and I don't want to mock that, but I do think he will probably not be discussed, in part because we don't think of Native people in positions like that. He was unusual, but you know, we also don't necessarily know history in this country very well.
It's often a footnote, and after that, you know, probably I don't know if you've seen the memes I have the last few days when CNN mentioned African Americans and it was, you know, kind of breaking down the voting population, and there was a mention of something else, like people who were something else. So American Indians were part of the something else. And so everybody's been joking about that the last couple of days. We're sort of out of time. I wish we had time because the questions are really good and smart, but you can email Sally and Cathleen or me if you have questions for us. But I would also mention some of the things that we know about this election this week, even though we don't obviously the story has not been finalized and we're still watching television tonight, but I did hear that 6 American Indians were elected to Congress this past week. And so surely that is sort of a milestone.
Well, what a wonderful way to end our program. I think we could go on easily for another hour or two, but we've unfortunately run out of time. Thank you so much, Kathleen, Sally, Brenda, for an extraordinary program. And thank you to our audience for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We'll see you next time.